So my guiding question for this presentation really is, how has LA Metro's rail and bus rapid transit systems shifted both the behaviors of Angelenos as well as the perception of LA with regards to scenes and scenescapes as we've discussed them in class? So, for those of you who don't know Los Angeles already,
Why don't you take your mask off while you're talking? That's fine. Or just slide it down a little more. That's
Okay.
good.
for those of you who don't know, Los Angeles is internationally known as a car city. It's built around suburbs. The vast majority of LA is zoned for suburbs. LA perhaps defined the modern freeway. And for what it's worth, Los Angeles is really emblematic of very traditional conceptions of the American dream, of having a single family home, having a lawn, as one politician put it locally, having your own lawn and a swimming pool, having a car. So it's a city that is very much at odds with the traditional Chicago-esque conception of a city. Public transit and transit-oriented development, which entails building near houses, building near denser constructions, is much more associated with these traditional Chicago-esque cities. So Los Angeles has been funding public transit, has been funding rail and bus rapid transit since the 1980s. So I wanted to conduct a literature review to see, has this growing network of public transit shifted people's behavior, and has it shifted the way people view LA as a city? Has it shifted the scene of LA? So I think it's important to state, LA Metro is pretty robust. It serves a county of 10 million people, which by far is the largest county in the United States. The next largest is Cook County at 5 million. So LA County is physically very large, and population-wise is the largest. There are 8 lines. They have been funded both by federal monies, but locally by the measure of sales tax that I'll bring up later. And for various political, logistical reasons, there are 3 types of rapid transit. There's heavy rail, which serves the red and purple line on the map. There is light rail, which serves every other line you see here, save for the gray commuter lines. And there is bus rapid transit, which, while not on this map, was constructed in very specific contexts to serve as an alternative to both heavy and light rail. The variables I assessed in my literature review were the following. Ridership. I will show a visual later in this presentation of LA Metro ridership from 2009 to 2019. Transit-oriented design, which, as I mentioned before, relates to building near transit stops, building more densely, apartments, multi-use structures, more than single-story structures around transit stops. And finally, political support. I'll look at the history of support for LA public transit, as well as support and opposition to related bills and policies like densification. So, here's my thesis. The LA Metro, so far in its 30-year history, has indeed shifted behavior in LA, has indeed shifted perceptions of what LA as a city, as a scenescape should be, but it hasn't done that much. And I'll get into why. But I'll also get into why the Metro over time.
Yeah, do you have a time estimate? That is we said about 10 minutes max. So.
Oh, I am more than halfway done with my presentation.
Perfect. Okay.
I'm going to go through some of my evidence.
Okay, fine.
But
sorry.
all good. The TLDR is the Metro hasn't shifted LA so much yet, but in the next 20, 30 years, it really does have the potential to remake both LA's behavior, turning it into a transit-oriented city, in the process, helping shift LA's perception of itself. So here's evidence in brief. Ridership has been declining since before the pandemic, and that's something that academics in the area, public policy experts in the area were really flummoxed by. And the current reason, ironically, is the main audience, lower income people, are owning more cars. And again, this was before the pandemic occurred. So the recommendation by these experts actually was to appeal to people who currently don't use transit. And that's going to be discussed later in terms of ramifications. Further evidence in brief. The Brookings Institution conducted a very interesting study of the 5 to 10 year impact of building transit stops on different parts of LA City. And what they found is in areas where there was potential for economic growth, where there was appropriate zoning to allow for the construction of multi-use, commercial, multifamily homes, you really did see a positive impact. But for areas where zoning was more restrictive, or for areas where there really wasn't major economic activity, the impact was not so pronounced. And they also actually found that in places that were already rich in jobs, there wasn't an immediate shift. They really found that a lot of these impacts did occur over 5 to 10 years rather than instantly. And then finally, evidence in brief. LA actually has a long tradition of supporting public transit. But one thing that LA hasn't supported as aggressively is densification efforts. And that, to an extent, has begun to change. SB 9, a California state bill that allows for the construction of more homes, passed with 9 state assembly votes yes in LA, 7 abstentions, and 6 no. And as the New York Times said, this was the first victory for densification after years of failure. So, what does this all mean? How am I going to address this? As I mentioned before, the traditional scene of LA really does hew close to this traditional American dream of individualism and independence, of having a car, having a private neighborhood. And it's a scene that is really at odds with the cosmopolitan scene of the traditional city, where you have these walkable, connected, diverse, growing communities. Metro is in the process of shifting LA's scene by both being shifted by increasing support for public transit and in turn influencing people to continue to support public transit. This is a map of what the Metro will look like in time for the 2028 Olympics. And as you can see, it's growing. There is ongoing construction in LA that has continued even through the pandemic to expand this network. So while there has been setbacks in terms of getting people out of their cars, of getting people to use public transit, getting people to support, build both the zoning for new construction and also allowing for public transit to motivate the kind of growth in terms of housing and in terms of businesses that people initially envisioned, there really is the long-term potential for both the behavior of Angelenos to be shifted as this network continues to grow, as these laws continue to change, and in turn, that will shift. It both reflects a shift in perception of the scene of LA as a more cosmopolitan, traditional city versus its suburban past, and it reflects in itself a continued shifting of that perception on the part of the rail as it continues to become ideally more useful to its residents. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any brief questions if that's like a thing.
Yeah,
Sure. Any questions? Yeah. Okay. Any of us here? Okay. Let me go into some of my more general comments, as what you have presented is perfect in the sense that it directly links with the main literature, some of the main literature, the main hypothesis about both LA and the US and some variations internationally. That is, the big enemy to simplify is the car. and so and behind that is business, and behind that is capitalism, and so there are several studies written, published on LA that elaborate this point. The two most widely read are first Michael Dear, D-E-A-R, and there were really 3 Michaels: Michael Dear, Michael Davis, and there's a Michael who's the guy who wrote about, he's from basically from Michigan, writing about capitalism. But all three have basically a similar general fundamental orientation, which fits with your labeling of, quote, the enemy.
I am in fact citing Mike Davis' City of Ports in my study as part of constructing the traditional LA scene and identity.
Yeah, excellent. And so Davis basically, Mike Davis and Michael Deere have said explicitly that they are Marxists, and they're using a capitalist business domination opposition to freeways, but to public transit, and in favor of the freeways and the car and the individualism. And we don't need to, okay, so then the question, there are multiple questions interrelated, but what you presented is excellent in both in terms of the short-term changes where people as users are saying, we're just sitting in traffic so much, so long, it's so terrible, we really, and this is both downtown LA, which you see there as in a sense as a solution, as well as many of the suburbs. I mean, if you're commuting from Orange County or San Fernando Valley, I mean, it's even further for a commute, and they jam up those freeways. And I taught at UCLA to try, and then I trained for a marathon, running at night. Every other day, I went all over the suburbs, Central City, different neighborhoods, and it's phenomenal. So what you're describing as the people suffering and talking about it and saying what can be done is clearly present in the civic meetings and the government meetings that I personally attended, with very much these concerns centrally, explicitly in mind. Okay, let's look at a couple of examples of this. The quick general point for this last section of the course is policy outputs, and so you have those in your transit and transit policy, and the propositions being passed. LA is again perfect because the state of California uses propositions more than any other state in the country. There are only a few that do a bit, such as Ohio. There are others which may be informal, but they're not legally binding. So after Prop 13 passed and cut property taxes by half, Michigan and Massachusetts did the same, illustrating the same taxpayers' revolt, but it wasn't legally binding the way it was in California. So California's a great case.
It is interesting that you mentioned Prop 13, because one of the big hurdles was in more recent ballots. The California Supreme Court determined that if you wanted to do sales taxes, such as for funding public transit, that is subject to Prop 13. So even if you got 66% of the vote, if you didn't get more than 67% of the vote, you failed. So it was a major victory for the state that the most recent two major propositions did pass with 67% of the vote and then 70% of the votes.
Okay, excellent point. Adding more detail to my more general. Again, reminding all of the more general, the earlier readings that we covered on the list, from the very first section on leadership with Clarence Stone, the Linds, then Hunter, and following up Elkin on Texas towns, Swanstrom on Cleveland, Caro on New York and the Greater Port of New York Authority, then Tony Oram on Austin, all talk about business. And business dominance is a major kind of point. This was then codified in the book by Logan and Molich, Urban Fortunes. And again, they themselves were a little bit. What if could we close maybe halfway so some of the other windows is the ones here in the front are fine. Yeah,
so close these halfway?
yeah. Leave those the way they are. No, but the ones you're doing the right thing. Thank you. I will add as well the Logan and Molich, and for Chicago, the Chicago version of that is what the Chicago student Harvey Molich published in a paper called "The City is a Growth Machine." And the growth machine image really is the sort of the American practical business actors, in contrast to the abstract conception of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory from Adorno, which would talk about advertising and the like more abstractly. All these really fit with your story, and that is, you've presented it perfectly. I mean, you don't say it's this or it's that. You're introducing a multi-causal, I'm sort of articulating for the others, you're introducing a multi-causal conception, and showing how in different neighborhoods and with different subgroups within LA, you have disagreements, and this is very much what we have increasingly, as evidenced, for instance, by Bill Morris's presentation when he was here. He is mayor of Waukegan, was doing ultra progressive things. He was fighting business. He was fighting against the traditions. That is, he was trying to articulate citizen preferences, as you're ending with here, fully and more fully than has happened in LA. And he was 20 years plus ahead. And so a related point from that example is to look at outliers, look at extreme cases. And you don't have to go that far in California. Look at San Francisco. Look at Napa Valley and other places, Berkeley and so forth, north of LA, and you find many elements of the opposite. You have a highly kind of, quote, progressive, interventionist, government-led culture, which is much stronger in the northern half of California. These are people who migrated more, as Elazar pointed out, from New England and the Middle Atlantic states, whereas as LA has got some of the Middle Atlantic individualism and a strong form of the car and the cowboy, combined with the Southern dominance of the older the older military style and a sense of the WASP exclusionary downtown LA conservative, quote, orientation. So these are fought out within LA. Oh, yeah. In ways that amaze me how present they still are. There's still 2 magazines that are published for the old sort of WASPy elite, or there were when I was teaching at UCLA and digging into these things. On daily stuff, the LA Times covers regularly battles among these kinds of ethnic and other groups in ways that Chicago does not. Chicago has a long history of ethnic politics and battles and so forth, but people are more compromising in Chicago than even in LA. Okay, and the most extreme people have just left. I mean, they've moved to Nevada, they moved to Alaska, they moved to small towns and rural areas around the country, leaving this to be fought out by the folks who are still there. Okay, the business dominance worldwide we've reviewed in the international FAUI studies, which are summarized in the paper with Clemente Navarro and others. I briefly mentioned essentially that you have three kinds of models: business dominance, government dominance, which is stronger and visibly in Europe, and let's say add more, China, Russia, in Russia in the past and China right now. And the third is sort of a pluralistic combination of these, and you're pointing out those elements which are present in this respect within LA. So we can see some of the differences, and we've had the explosion of this third type is what we call diversity, we can say, in the sense that one is recognizing under the label of diversity not one group, but 4 or 5 active groups: women, gays, African Americans, maybe okay, and potentially human rights, and potentially social organizations representing these. These were studied and these have been studied empirically in some other works that I'll mention now, so that we can see city differences in these and neighborhood differences if we drill down and have enough cases to do that. Do we maybe get ready? Not quite yet, but get ready for my PowerPoint. There are other readings in the section I'll just mention briefly. Green and Fleischman studied educational policies of the city government and report more such efforts in larger cities, regions where other cities are providing more incentives, measured by the average level of economic development of cities in the region, and less where the business is a lead actor, and more where government, less business incentives by government, and more incentives where government is the lead actor. There's in some respects, the opposite of the view that business dominance would lead to business incentives as a payoff to developers, but this is not interpreted as being a function of business having fewer resources. It seems partially unconvincing, I would say, the Green and Fleischman study. Better, and so that goes back a couple of decades, but it was one of the main national studies in this respect. Second, more serious national, well, let me mention one more. That is, in most of these, we start with case studies of some individual towns, and by often college towns or nearby colleges, and then we get to some national studies later on. So in this respect, are state studies. So good example here is Mark Baldessari, who, as the director of survey research at University of California, Irvine, studied the most studied, because of him, the most studied county in the United States, probably the world, Orange County. He did surveys every year or two of the citizens, the council members, the mayor, and then certain related policies. And then some case studies along with that were especially Irvine. So the mayor of Irvine in the 70s basically created a national organization of mayors who thought in similar manner, including one mayor in Vermont who's become famous in more recent years nationally, and we talked about. But they would do things in Orange County, but like hold arms at 5 o'clock rush hour, and the citizens holding arms with the mayor would block all traffic to stop in the middle of rush hour in the middle of Orange County on 405, the biggest freeway. Okay, so the opposition is not just imaginary. That is, we don't have a case of, remember, negative decisions and non-decisions. We don't have a non-decision. We have negative decisions of people attacking the car dominance and trying to change things at the same time. And this is the town, this is the county where the airport is named. John Wayne Airport. Okay, so the John Wayne image, the Ronald Reagan cowboy, is the classic traditional symbolic image of Orange County. And Baldessari showed how this changed as more women became more active, more civic groups became more active, more anti-establishment, and including the city manager anti-establishment, which we documented, which was documented and used in the course readings in 3 versions of the book that started with 10 counties around, 10 towns around the Bay Area, San Francisco, 6 of which passed these kinds of things. Could in the back, can we close the door there? Thanks. The 6 of the 10 really moved in this kind of direction against the traditional city manager and against the quiet business dominance, which was documented earlier in another study of Pruitt, of Ken Pruitt, in the Bay Area only. Baldessari's most dramatic case was Tahoe, again, it's all California. The business leadership of Lake Tahoe was completely, at least publicly and in terms of voting, articulating policy preferences, the business leadership was in agreement with everyone else that the beauty of Tahoe is the lake. It must be preserved. We don't want business growth or dominance in a way that would interfere with that natural amenity. And you do have this to some degree in some other locations as well. That is, and we have this increasing, as documented by Ronald Inglehart, surveys of citizens around the entire world are increasingly focused on the so-called symbolic post-material culture, where aesthetics are more sensitive in the rise of the arts. So this again, we've seen through the course. Okay, so he found it in one dramatic case of Tahoe, and then there were follow-ups on aspects of that, of looking more closely at what are the, instead of saying who's important, the Dahl Hunter question, the follow-up question is, and I'll just put it on the board to remind you again, same thing that you've seen with what I put it on from my work. You saw a very similar kind of leadership box from Barbara Furman that we had on the screen last time. Instead of just studying who governs, there's a focus as well, especially on policy outputs, and what are the kinds of policy outputs that the leadership supports. And I've described Tahoe, but the point is, it varies. And that has been increasingly shown with more careful studies of evidence from larger numbers of cities and then contrasting. At the same time, we also add in more explicitly citizens. That is, if you don't measure and don't ask the citizens what do they want, and if they want if they want economic growth and to trying to increase the value of their homes, that's the business policy that's the growth policy, the economic development growth policy, which the leadership is saying citizens want it, business want it, everybody wants it, so we're doing it. And that's the argument of Schumacher, based on especially Lawrence, Kansas. So Lawrence, Kansas, in that sense, was the opposite of Tahoe. So studying outlier cases, but they both had, it's an outlier in the policy, but it's the same, they're similar in showing consensus, or let's say moderate consensus between the business and the citizens. That business, so knowing you may have important business actors does not tell you what do the business leaders want. Maybe they want their citizens too. They have employees who are citizens. Maybe they want to do what the president of Hewlett-Packard has said, the president of Nuveen here in Chicago had said, which we have quotes from. We want to do things which make our citizens, our respondents, our investors satisfied, and we follow local policies and preferences. They advertise etc. They advertise about this, and they do it in Chicago, in Tahoe, and in Texas, where, again, the tradition of business dominance is clear and strong. On the other hand, if we then begin to look more closely, what are the policies, as I'm saying, these vary, and we can then look at other bits of evidence which we have for this, and how could it be done better if we proceed. Moving a little bit ahead here. Ed Getz had data on his so-called Type 2 policies, which were closer to Donald Rosdol's, who had who studied these cities nationally, including places like Santa Monica, Irvine, Tahoe, had anti-business kinds of leadership in ways that San Francisco was the largest city to adopt more seriously. But if we look at these have led to a list of kinds of policies which have been asked about in surveys done by the International City Management Association, and then the state of California agency had done a survey. So when Ed Getz and I have spent a summer together in Colorado talking about these kinds of things, and we combined our data and published a paper together, which is in the Urban Innovation book. And so so we have four or five national and state of California studies. Then we had 5 or so case studies on the major cities which had implemented policies that were anti-growth, which is what you're talking about, the referendum on density. That's exactly, it's a strong, perfect case, perfect illustration of an anti-growth policy, which was taken to the citizens, and the citizens are supporting this kind of policy. Okay, this fits perfectly with what I'm saying here. Okay, so across California, what the survey showed was that San Francisco was doing this with a vengeance. San Francisco was having, public hearings if the shadows of a potentially new high-rise building might bother the people across the street or nearby. And they would and based on that kind of concern with the shadows and potential bad effects, they limited the number of high-rise buildings that could be constructed. And when this was first done under Dianne Feinstein, you could only construct 2 high-rise buildings in San Francisco per year, period. Okay, so that kind of thing illustrates, and so I'll just list some of the others which were used in these other surveys. The developer should be forced to contribute a certain share of its profits for housing for lower income persons, for transportation mitigation or improvement of public transit, for hiring or training of local residents. 4, 5th, provision of social services directly, more social services, counseling to people, etc., by the developers. Then questions of the percentage of the involvement of women or minority business enterprises. This has now been widely used. Chicago has had this since Harold Washington, that the proportion of minority or women or both businesses lead big firms to have to contract with smaller firms where you may have minority and business entrepreneurs, and this can be 20%, it can be 40%, depending. So this is in my Bronzeville discussions with the aldermen. These are big issues for this big project being discussed right next to the former Michael Reese Hospital, just south of McCormick Place. Finally, technical assistance to community-based organizations. Okay, so this is a checklist of survey items, and we then analyzed these nationally as well as within California, and found that 72% of jurisdictions surveyed used at least one of these. The more that the traditional incentives were used, the more that the Type 2 policies are also used. So we call these Type 2 policies, a not very fancy name, but Type 1 is traditional business incentives, like giving more, giving a tax abatement subsidy if you build a new building. So that's a pro-construction, a pro-growth policy. Even if some towns did have those pro-construction policies, they also may have done more government-driven policies to assist the people who might suffer from that new construction. And this, in the case studies which we have of the Millennium Park and of Toronto, these kinds of dynamics are illustrated. But with contrast, the relative civic and business leadership was more important in Chicago. It was weaker, much weaker in the past, with a very arts, citizen, neighborhood-oriented mayor in Toronto, who was then voted out by Mayor Ford, who was against the bikes and against the artists, explicitly, and in favor of people with their cars who lived in outlying areas of Toronto. Okay. There was then another survey which was done in our FAUI cities, and so we have results for these in the paper. These are in a number of places, but basically, there was a question which was asked in our FAUI surveys: how much do the policies, the policy outputs, respond to or represent the concerns of women, minorities, neighborhood residents, and as well as a longer list including business, and maybe 4 or 5 others. But those are among the most important. Unions. Okay, so we have an integrated systems model, and we tried to ask how strong, A, B, C, D, E. How strong was not just this is not, quote, perception. This is the views of the city council and the mayor. So if they say, we're responding to women and we're voting on it, and we know the proportion of minority and women contracts that are being given, that's not just a perception. This is what this is what we're doing. And so that was the question, and then we repeated this question in the 1980s, I think it's the 80s and then 90s, and the change was dramatic. In the 80s, there was much more visible reported business leadership, and if something were, and there was also a question: how close are you, the mayor, you, the city council member, to each of these groups? Citizens, business, unions, and so forth. And on both of those, the council and the council's preferences of how close are you and what are the policies responding to. Basically, the council and the mayor could be and were sometimes divided. So there were clearly differences within councils, and that's what Bill Morris and we're also talking about, where these sectors have conflicts, and so that it's not as if there's consensus. But nevertheless, we could see, if we look at just the simple how strong is Path A? How much does the council say they're responding, say, to minorities and to women? And the answer was, in the 80s, it was negative. That is, they would respond less than to the other groups, and if they they reported less responsiveness. In the 90s, it was the opposite. That they said their policies were more responsive to the women and minorities than to the other groups. These were local governments, representative, but they included both Democratic and Republican majorities. So we have party differences, we have age differences, education differences, but those kinds of things, that is, the politicization by party in local government is much weaker in the U.S. than at the national level. So what you see on television, what you hear from all this stuff about the national government, was deeply different in many local governments 20 years ago. What we get today, with some mayors like Chicago with Mallory Lightfoot, and New York, Chicago, and LA, all three had very strong activist, so-called progressive mayors, fighting, defunding the police, actively taking that kind of policy position, and taking position in favor of minority, more responsiveness to closer to Black Lives Matter, basically. Okay. Other cities we don't have evidence for so systematically, but based on the past, clearly we've got a lot of differences. Some are so, but in the in the national story, we have these kinds of new patterns emerging locally, which I'm describing beginning in a majority of American cities in the 1990s. That is, women and minorities were more actively responded to from the 1990s forward, according to the surveys of the council members and mayors themselves. I'm closer to, and I vote for things which are, and so in that sense, diversity is about 25 years old, as measured by council members and mayors. They started doing it before survey in the 90s. I will then remind you, however, that when we had the major elections of pro-African American mayors and others and other left progressive mayors in 1968 or around 68. And when those mayors, I shouldn't say election, when those mayors were elected, and when they may have not been elected on these issues, but they responded to perhaps the organized groups that were and this was documented in the City Money book. The organized groups, especially African Americans, unions of the municipal employees, and students protesting against the Vietnam War. These were the three main groups, and they were more active and more progressive, and that is what's today called progressive. And those mayors adopted policies more for those three organized groups and less for the average citizens, which they didn't know perhaps what citizens generally wanted. But in the next elections, those mayors were voted out, or they changed. And so we had we had in turn the clear big event after the '68 progressive move was Prop 13. Then in Michigan, then in California, and in a sense across much of the country. The analog with the police, of course, was as I mentioned briefly, the broken windows theory. Bradley, who was police chief of Boston, then he went to New York, then he went to LA, then he came back to New York. That kind of set of policies of showing that we want a scene. The broken windows theory can be called a scene theory, of saying we don't want any broken windows. The scene should have all the windows fixed and nobody loitering and hanging around and selling drugs, prostitutes, etc., looking dangerous to someone wanting to walk to a subway or whatever. And Forrest Stewart documented this brilliantly in his first book on LA and then second on Chicago, of showing after his 1 year of field work, Bradley came to LA and all the streets which were dominated by the homeless and were filled with people, as soon as the police started doing what they did in New York called stop and frisk, nobody was there. It took about a week or two. Okay. So these in turn have led to the crime rate, and as Bradley has written, and Bradley et al., stories in the New York Times editorial page, etc., that the proportion of people in jail has gone down substantially from basically the 60s onward. So less than half as many people are in jail as were in jail earlier, before these broken windows kinds of policies were implemented. Okay, is that good or bad? I followed up and I said, the bad side of that, if you are concerned with the well-being, the mental outlook of minorities and poor people with criminal records, the most visible thing which has been discussed and debated is the feeling that we're being supervised, where there's a couple of labels for this with 4-letter words and so forth, but the cops are watching for us, and there's surveillance. Surveillance is all present, and therefore I don't want to have stop and frisk, because they'll know I have a criminal record. They'll take me in. They may find something else that I haven't been arrested for, etc. Okay, so and then this in turn, this anti-surveillance was a kind of policy, was part of what led to the election of, let's say, Lori Lightfoot, and the policies in New York and LA. So okay, so these overlap obviously with national and some of this international. Look at the Netherlands right now. But look at the protests against the COVID measures being fought over, and they're burning police cars in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The peaceful Dutch burning police cars. My God, this is unheard of. So these things are sensitive globally. Not to mention, of course, the Middle East, Hong Kong, Ukraine, Belarus right now, etc. Okay, this week, On Friday, we will have a session for the city of Shanghai. So it's organized by the head of the sociology department at perhaps one of the top universities in all of China. Is considered the top university in Beijing. Beijing is the largest city in China. It's about 4 times bigger than New York or London or Paris. They have about a year ago, the university and the city, the mayor and the president of the university have a photo. We just came out. We don't have that in the slides, but they launched a new urban innovation center together. There's a picture of them when they're in their white shirt sleeves, pulling the cover off the opening of urban innovation, technology, and more lifestyle kind of center. And then it adds, and that was done just before, but then in February, the 5-year plan came out, which said we have 5 areas where you should use scenes. And the city of Shanghai has officially said to this Technology Innovation Center, you must follow scenes. Okay, so then in turn, I got a phone call. I saw you. The guy came into class last week. He's a second year student in the Harris School. I talked to now with the executive director of the Urban Innovation Center. They have joined with the meeting. So we're going to have a meeting this week with this major center. He's a professor of public policy at the university with sociology, and then with people nationally of our Scenes Academy who've been working on these kinds of issues. Okay, so what the executive director of public policy who in Shanghai is similar to many of the faculty at the Harris School. He has 1 PhD in mathematics and 1 PhD in economics. Okay, let's show just a little bit of what we have, because so what I have is some new material of what can we do about scenes, and because one of the goals which they have is digitalization of the data they have available for all of let's go slowly, and I don't want to go too far from here, but in terms of the viewers, why don't we turn this camera or whatever, or which one? Are you using both, or?
Yeah, so this will automatically record that,
Okay.
because I'm going to share the screen. You want me to turn that to face the presentation?
Yes, please.
Of course.
Okay, so that's great. So the new theme which I've added here in some of this presentation, which is a draft which I'm starting out with you to react to, much welcome, is some of the elements which we want to discuss, which include digitalization and scenes and the concerns of the sociology department, which in the sessions during the whole month of November in Beijing, they have been discussing a couple of key neighborhoods, including a French traditionally culture-oriented neighborhood in Shanghai, and they had one full session on, guess who? Baudelaire, the poet. Right out of and Baudelaire, I'll remind you, was the editor, and he started a journal of Wagnerian studies in Paris around 1870. Okay, so these concerns are alive and well in Beijing today. I attended another sessions of the Scenes Academy 2 weeks ago when I heard two presentations on these neighborhoods in Shanghai, and the head of the sociology commenting on this. And she's now using scenes analysis to say, well, I think that it's a new interesting idea. How to join scenes criteria with citizens. So she made the statement that one development was too high on theatricality and not high enough on authenticity, whereas the other one was about right on both. I mean, that's a very interesting kind of criterion of trying not to say I like it or I don't, or Baudelaire liked it, or in his poem, but to try to say how can we measure or capture through digitalization of neighborhood citizens and other data, such as the numbers of cafes, the number of used bookstores. How can we measure what Baudelaire talked about with digitalization in Paris, Chicago, Shanghai. And so let's look at some of that. And no, sorry, maybe back up. Okay, so these are some of the scenes participants, as we haven't shown these to you before. Dan Silver on the left, Clemente Navarro in Seville on the right, and Qi Ji, who will be a major presenter as well with me on, she'll be a discussant with the others. She's from Beijing. She was here 2 years ago in this room. We did a number of sessions together. And she's a major founder of the Scenes Academy. Okay, let's go on. Okay, so here's a way. This is from the Cities and Entertainment Machine. This shows how there is not a conflict between the classic material economic development concerns of which are labeled in by Marshall and others at the end of the 19th century, or he articulated them more forcefully. Land, labor, capital, and management. That drives economic growth. And then economic growth in turn attracts population. People move to the jobs because the jobs are there, created by capital. Okay, and that's also close to parts of that. Is Marx didn't have all of these. He didn't have. That is, he left out land. Marx, I told you that Marx dropped the three classes that Adam Smith and Malthus had used. Marx reduced this to capitalists versus proletarians. Marshall brought back in land. And so people working on cities and having an urban neighborhood focus are saying, aha, yes, that's what we do want. And so that's, in a sense, that was early 20th century economics. The next big step was Gary Becker. Okay, so Gary Becker's PhD published was called Human Capital. And human capital is what, in simple terms? Not only, but the simple measure used was education. More educated the citizens, the more educated folks will in turn use land, labor, and capital, the resources, more efficiently. So you can make things faster, cheaper, better by using technology, iPhones, machines, automation, and you need fewer and fewer broad backs, tough people who just lift the heavy weight. That's done by machinery as well as by smarter people, and clearly we see this in Silicon Valley, we see this in iPhones, we see this in the internet. It's happening all over the world, but especially led by places in Silicon Valley. Okay, how do we follow up on the human capital model from Gary Becker? The amenity model, again, was started here in the economics department, but they would talk about individual amenities, like having one cinema or counting the number of cinemas, and then trying to estimate the multiplier effect of cinemas independent of everything else. But they didn't have the data to measure what's independent. They just say assume ceteris paribus. So you try to estimate the path coefficient. What this framework says, don't try to do that unless you've got a lot of data. And so the economists doing this theorized brilliantly, but as soon as one new younger economist would bring in one more variable, he'd say, oh no, look at all the past work on this is wrong. I brought in one more variable like unionization. And that changes all the multiplier effects. Okay, so our answer to that is get more data from the beginning, and that's what the big data revolution is now giving us. We've got tons of data, but it hasn't been analyzed in this kind of framework in a coherent way. But it's starting slowly, and that's what the Shanghai people now have the commitment, the resources to do, and they may do so before, and was done to some degree in Orange County. So these are cutting edge, and then with Dianne Feinstein as mayor of San Francisco. So if we look at these outlier cases, they illustrate things that may spread nationally across China, and as well as other. So let's push on from here. So in a sense, there's no conflict among any of these three theories, is my point. There's no conflict. They all matter. And we need data for all of them to assess how important they are, alone and combined, such as business combined with citizens, combined with unions. If they all want the same thing, fine. Okay. So back up. Okay. Which amenities and places attract talent and drive innovation? That's the policy question which comes from that last path diagram. Theories, digitalization, and testing models, below. Okay. Next. What's happening to your slide? Oh, okay, here we go. Okay, so Schumpeter, competition and destruction creates innovation. That's his big theory, and he's most widely cited. I will mention in passing, this directly connects, of course, with Balzac, Baudelaire, and others who stressed the flaneur, the shopper, as also supporting innovation. But Schumpeter is often taken, and it's in his text, competition, destruction, the way you can have innovation of all firms is, okay, kill off the old and permit that to happen regularly. Okay, Gary Becker adds human capital, as I mentioned. Third, Kuznets, how to measure and model these processes, welfare, utility, GNP as a model. Push on to the, so you see pictures of the three. Okay, so here's, in the 1930s, Keynes et al. Sought to create socialist policies, especially the English. The English economists were very actively working with the Labour Party. And they tried to create welfare policies that would work and were informed by the best economics of the time, but they had no data. Keynes wrote essays. They had no math, no explicit systematic models, and no data. Kuznets, working simultaneously in the 1930s, said we have to measure GNP. We have to measure things like this. So his PhD he was in Russia under Stalin, and he did a PhD in how one city in Russia could measure and affect this, and he then took this it came to the U.S. and showed how this could be done by the U.S. Census. The U.S. Census started to do this. And Kuznets, however, helped, while he developed Measure GNP, he disapproved of its overuse to measure welfare, writing, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. So the classic definition in response to this of amenities is non-market goods, since utility, as the economists talk about it, equals income plus amenities. This is elaborated by Gary Becker and his students like Ed Glazer, who suggest that amenities are far more important for cities than market goods. And it's not as if we need to deny the markets of good restaurants, fancy restaurants, or McDonald's, or others, but you can conceptualize the presence of lots of restaurants as an amenity, even if you never go there and pay. So having restaurants as a potential place where you can spend changes your feel of North Michigan Avenue. It can also lead to a sense of resentment that I don't have enough money to go to North Michigan Avenue and buy those clothes. And so if we burn the cops' cars, we're going to smash the windows and take the stuff right out ourselves. And that was Chicago 2 summers ago. So that sense of resentment, but that is the amenity and the disamenity which that in turn creates, that those firms, some of the largest firms are closing down. So Macy's closed down its major store on North Michigan Avenue, right in the Water Tower building. So it's okay, etc. Push on. Which amenities attract talent and why? Which policies are popular? Rise, and here big answer, you've heard in the course, rise of the arts. And rise of the arts in lifestyle, the economy, and government. And these are the 3 areas that the Urban Innovation Center in Shanghai is planning to work on. And so they have not talked, they may not know about this big point, which I've assembled bits of evidence for here, the rise of the arts. And so this can include things for citizen lifestyle, things like parks and cultural activities, neighborhood decoration, home decoration, clothes, food style, music, identity activities, including diversity as politically articulated. Second, in the economy, less focus on production, more on consumption specifics, like for some, car design in Detroit, for others, anti-car, bicycles, walking, public transit, as in LA, as we heard earlier now, restaurants, cafes, niche marketing, and third, in government and civic activities. That is, the aesthetic, the tastes aspects of consumption are drivers. This is the flaneur applied. Third, government and civic activities, less class conflict and state rewards, whether it's in China or Russia in the past, in 1917 or 1921, or in the whole 19th century, and in some ways up to present in France, where the state is still actively promoting kinds of policies in ways that follow a broadly was termed Republican. It wasn't called left or right. It tried to say Republic, but Republic was essentially also anti-clerical, anti-elitist, anti-aristocratic, and government can be also less clientelist, with generally now weaker political parties, stronger social media and citizens, more civic organizations and members, and where nationalism and legitimacy via symbolic leadership, spectacle like parades, Olympic Games, libraries, and cultural centers, and what the Chinese then talk about as cultural policy. We don't talk about it so much because government is weaker here, but in China, it's cultural policy is very big stuff, as it is in France. Okay, push on. What else do we have? Okay. Probably the social scientists who made the biggest impact, not just in economics, but in creating marketing, the whole field of quantitative marketing, surveys of citizens, citizen surveys, National Opinion Research Center across the Midway, the Michigan Center. These things really came from Lazarsfeld and this kind of stuff. I studied with him at Columbia, again, PhD in math, immigrant from Nazi Europe, and leader in doing this kind of thing in these kinds of books. Personal influence of how important it was, and that's what Ed Glazer has documented. Personal relationships are really the drivers of happiness, as surveyed by NORC across the Midway. Push on. Join hundreds of leitmotifs and myths to create an integrated artwork. Music plus text plus acting equals passion. Romantic nationalism, Wagner. Then Claude Lévi-Strauss picked this same kind of thing up and did it he wasn't a composer, he did it in categorizing, listing by number, say myth 293. As this variation of the Oedipus complex changes, that will change with kinship patterns, that will change with other things as you move from. So he used the Trobriand Islanders of the British anthropology, because he knew so much anthropology fieldwork. He knew, and then he'd check on stuff, but he had a lot of this right in his head. And then he would take the variations of those myths within especially the Brazilian jungle areas, which he had the great detail on. And so the point is, this in turn is a model for how to do social science. Take the little bits of views about, so a myth can be political culture as well. Should you cross, it can be a norm. Should you cross the street when the light is red? No, that's jaywalking, which is what you say in Chicago, or that is, people don't say no, they do it. They jaywalk all the time in the U.S. You go to Australia, you go to parts of Austria, and citizens will say, no, the light is red, you can't cross. There are big differences. Okay, let's push on down. Arcade, we've seen. No factories, no smoke. Which city seen? Let's push on. So this is, of course, Benjamin and Brecht arguing over some of this kind of thing. But Benjamin, great theorist of this, as we've seen. Push on. This you've seen initially, the new political culture, and then this in turn became the framework, adding really the cultural factors, stressing these more with scenes. The whole idea of the end of absolutes, the decline in the quest for Cartesian certainty, and a Newtonian-like mechanism, the rise of relativity, hermeneutics, pragmatism, Kuhn, constructivism, Picasso, Einstein, cultural pluralism. Okay, push on. Components of scenes, we've seen this, push on. Scenes again, 15 dimensions, push on. Okay, this is a big one for Shanghai. because they're used to technology. Build a cluster for high tech, make a little Silicon Valley right here in this neighborhood of Shanghai, and we should have more like Shanghai. Okay. And we show and so in Scenescapes, we've studied, technology centers in every zip code of the United States, and what do we find? There is a positive path right here, a direct path, but there's also an important interaction effect. If you have both a technology cluster and you have a self-expressive set of amenities like cafes, restaurants, places that people can be programmers, and then after they leave their job at Google, they walk around, if you want, in the north side neighborhood, near west side neighborhood it is called, just west of the Loop. The Google headquarters right there is in the middle of what? Anybody walk around there? Does it have lots of other firms that are doing programming? No. But there are a few, not so visible. But what is visible defining the neighborhood to the walker, or the bike, the cyclist? Restaurants, outside restaurants where you can eat during the summer, and outdoor cafes. It's filled with them, and people walking, looking as if they're wearing $1 million casual clothes. Plus others who are okay. So in that sense, that's the plus arrow from the scenes that promote self-expression. Okay. A self-expressive scene enhances the impact of technology clusters on the growth of jobs and the raising of rents potentially. So yes, this can drive gentrification. But if you have a mayor like Lori Lightfoot, she's then saying, okay, if you're going to build that building called Google, you're going to pay. You're going to do this. And we have the list of things which they could be and are doing in Chicago, and that's exactly the same situation in my neighborhood in Bronzeville. The developer of this activity around Google is the same developer we're working with right now in Bronzeville. Push on. Rise of the arts, we've seen this before, tripling in the U.S., and here it is internationally. The main country in Asia, the only country in Asia really, is Korea. So Korea has really had this rise of the arts, not as high as the U.S. or Netherlands, but still it's well higher. It's much higher than in China. Okay, let's push on. Leisure. This is U.S. stuff, but point is it's not cyclical. This is the Asian branch. That is, if we take these ideas to Asia, do they work? Does Benjamin work? Does Jane Jacobs? Does Tocqueville work? No. They never heard of Bohemian. They never heard of Bobo in Asia. So what can we do? Look at what they do have, and can that be, or is that being adapted? They have traditionally karaoke, but you see here just the names. These are mainly Asians. We talked for 7 years or so, and so we've got the chapters there of how to adapt Tocqueville so he can learn to karaoke. Okay. How and why join the arts in government policies? From the French royal castles and Versailles background, and I've learned that a label they're using today in Chinese social media is Versailles. Oh, he's Versailles. She's Versailles, and wearing that kind of stuff. Okay. The French Minister of Education, the first policy of André Malraux was make culture free to citizens and create culture houses in the small towns and medium size across France. President Georges Pompidou, shocked with the architecture and the content of culture and huge participation, worked in the picture. We'll show them. Just flash forward and then back if you can. Yeah, right there. Okay, so this is the shocking architecture with traditional Paris, but more visitors than the Louvre Museum or Eiffel Tower combined. It's called the neighborhood of Beaubourg, and it's also called officially the center of Georges Pompidou, by name for the president of France, who got the money to do this, and had an international, foreign, I think it was Italian and English architects who designed this, not French. Okay. Aesthetic eclecticism. Theaster Gates, artist, potter, singer, cook, architectural renovator, urban developer who helps poor African Americans improve their neighborhoods. Onward. Okay, so these are the two. So within France, cultural democracy after Malraux is more bottom up, and you have then both of these within France. Paris still has more of this. Marseille, and cities in the south, Nice, is growing much faster. Paris is stable. The whole northern France is stable. The south is booming. Onward. Eclectic combinations. The Malaga, Holy Week, Franco's Spanish Foreign Legion carrying Christ. Okay, onward. Susan Sontag, what is camp? Camp, mixed styles that do not fit together. Campy is now hugely used all over the world. Onward. Irony. Irony. So, in that sense, the rules of the game of left and right, formal, informal, elite, popular, no longer hold. People are mixing them up deliberately. Read Elle. Read the style magazines. You have African American models. You have jeans and toughness for men. The traditional images of gender roles are being challenged and changed. Paris seems examples. We contrast in these outlying regions as well as downtown. Push on. So here's income. Darkest on the far left where the more affluent people live. But let's see, does that map look like the other maps? Push on. Yes for glamour. Glamour is reasonably related, it seems, to the glamour as a measure of a scene. So push on. But so if we then look at correlation coefficients of types of scene, 3 types of scenes dimensions, of one of which is glamour, and in Spain, it looks as if that income is more positively related to these, but weak in the U.S. and Canada, and Korea negative more, and so Canada as well has some negative relationships here. However, most important, if we square a 0.2 correlation coefficient, we get 0.04, which is to say less than 0.5% of the variation is shared between income and glamour in the U.S. or Canada. Okay, push on. These are the detailed dimensions of the 15 dimensions of scenes as measured, and I'm mentioning that we don't have the French data. We only have maps. So push on. So maps are not. Nevertheless, we have. So here are the maps I'm just showing. This is egalitarianism is stronger in that, and these are the classic left, and this used to be called the red belt in the outlying part of Paris. Okay, push on. Completely new is Bobo, where you combine the egalitarianism and the transgression of Baudelaire and Benjamin with more income. Who created the bourgeois bohemian, the Bobo concept? Was it two French terms? Were they put together by a Frenchman? No. David Brooks, New York Times commentator, put them together. But next, push on. They have, here's no, this is all in French. Okay. The Bobo is constructed from multiple dimensions, and the Paris amenities are chosen to match the rhyming words of an ironic poem, Campy, which many French brand names rhyme with, of food and clothes. So so here, names of jeans, names of diesel, etc., etc. And here the map. Here's the map of these dimensions as they're scattered across different neighborhoods within Paris. Push on. Okay, here's Marseille, where we have these two ideals are contrasted. Push on. And here we have the same kind of thing. Gates and the black monks performing at a church that was being destroyed, and protesting not by writing, not by demonstrating, but by having the black monks of Mississippi, so-called, perform. Okay. So Theaster doesn't fight like Black Lives Matter. He does other things, and he has a deep sense of irony himself. He's very subtle, and he's also was the leader of the Cultural Policy Center at the Harris School. Okay, push on. Polish examples we have as well. This place was not only a cafe, it has a couple of hundred people in front of it where they're contesting, they're arguing over what the city might do for different neighborhoods and different kinds of policies in this respect. She had a case study of this basically. Push on. This is a traditional town with old, beaten up industry. This is the new image in a small and medium-sized Polish towns are doing this. Push on. And Bronzeville, leading traditional African, let's say, don't say traditional, past 20th century African American artist, The Stroll. Push on. And the data we start from, raw data for zip codes in the US, and these are ways of contrasting different locations with the data which the Chinese have. They've had basically most of these same things, push on, but they're getting it from social media, which is even better. Here are the top threes and top kinds of amenities for all of the US, push on. And then there's a backup, I think one there. Yeah, okay. This simply shows how important are glamour, self-expression, and tradition in driving economic growth, simply measured by the total numbers of jobs, which increased in the last decade or so. And one point here is the change in the self-expression is a major driver, and with all the control variables are not shown here, but they're in the next one, right there. So this has more controls. Crime rate, cost of living in the county, and population size were insignificant. The number one driver of job growth was that the number of arts jobs at the beginning of the time period, 1998. Education was number two. Insignificant were these classic things that many people still use. Push on. Bohemia, and then we had so you can create new measures. And the new, we went by too fast there. Just one before, I think. Bobo voting. Yeah, that's fine. Bobo voting, all that stuff around LA. These are people who are high. LA in general is high income, and especially if you look at Hollywood and these folks high in income and arts-related jobs. And the film industry is the number one industry traditionally in LA. These areas vote Bobo. Okay, push on. The drivers of jobs for the arts, where arts drive jobs rather than jobs driving arts, are on the two coasts and around Chicago and a little bit around New Orleans. But the blue is the small towns of the South and the American Midwest. These are where jobs come first and art comes later. Okay, push on. You need overtime data for that. Okay, maybe, is that almost the end? Okay, okay, so here's descriptive data. Political trust, look at China. 93% of Chinese citizens say they trust the national leadership. Now, national and local. Look what it is in France, 25%. France is closer to Latin America. But these can vary by neighborhood and by subgroups. And so if we look then at education, okay, I didn't show it because I'm a little, I'm sensitive. The causes of this in China, this has been shown by lots of people before. The more highly educated Chinese trust less. That's the opposite of most countries. So there are 50 papers on this, on that kind of finding, and so it's a very interesting, complicated issue. But Carrie Wu, who is co-author of this chapter in the and Analyze the Data, has been pursuing this. Prashad? This is just showing the variations in Paris that we identified, all kinds of stuff. Prashad? And the scenes books, Spanish, etc., Korean. And this I talked about a little bit, which is the Christina Sakamoto. Which of these are drivers? And that's what I concluded with that map, which showed the West Coast and East Coast versus the South, as a way of resolving that. That is, we have both in the U.S. But if we don't just look at the national average, we drill down to county data. That's my general point. Drill down to smaller units, and you can understand things better. And that's the rationale for the whole course. Okay, and I'll put there. We're over time, but I'll pause if there are any quick questions anybody wants to ask. Although what I've tried to do, as I think you can hear, is begin to synthesize the whole course with these things which match with LA, which match with individual cases like Chicago, Lake Tahoe, but link with the bigger theories. Business dominance being not necessarily, business still participates, but even if they lead, that doesn't tell us what they want. Okay, etc. We will thank you, and next class will be the official review session. Anything in the course is up for discussion, and we will see you on Wednesday. Thank you for leading off with that. I mean, your LA presentation was terrific.
Fantastic, Micah.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I addressed your feedback from before, putting about
You did perfectly.
focusing in on this. It's been very interesting because as Southern California doesn't get like I can tell you like which like I've taken the full length of the red line before. I've taken the full length of Expo line, and it's just an interesting experience to kind of analyze it from quite literally the bird's eye view. With regards to the final scenescapes, the final part of the presentation, is that like the newest kind of updated edition that you're proposing, kind of the final part about like making things like a final manuscript?
No, it may be, but the book does not have a second edition, but we're publishing papers, we're doing presentations at meetings, every week.
The presentation of like the final ideas, are those in the syllabus?
There are no final ideas, is what I'm saying. They change as we learn. We'll learn on Friday. If a student, or I mentioned the woman who's the sociology department head in Shanghai, she had a good idea that I heard for the first time about, maybe it sounded as if it's clear to you, but I hadn't thought it the way she had articulated this. We get new ideas all the time. That's why this is exciting and important. To learn from examples or policy people, and to talk about these. Bill Morris, if Bill Morris had a clear answer, he'd be telling it to you.
No, that's on me. I misspoke. I meant like just like the slide, the final slides where it was like lots of text. Are those in like? Can we find like those like texts in like in the modules on campus?
Yeah, tell me. The final slide was arrows and boxes of arrows. That is in the appendix. That is in not the appendix. That's in the. That's in multiple professional meeting papers, but it's about 2 or 3 pages in the chapter of the Scenescapes book, in the chapter on basically the methods chapter.